I appreciate it.
Hey, listen, everything that's going on in Israel and some of the other things kind of overshadowing a little bit of what's happening in Washington these days. I know you're officially on break, but there are still people talking about this fiscal cliff. Can you tell me where we are in all of that?
Well, a lot of uncertainty. It's been something we've known about in Washington, obviously coming for 2 years now, and I'm worried about that. If the president gets his way, we would have the single largest tax increase in American history. If nothing passes, he can veto anything and force that down. And his latest offer to Congress is you either raise taxes on a certain segment of the population, the so-called rich, or else I'm going to raise taxes on everybody. And at the end of the day, there's no tax increase that's going to create more jobs, and that's what we need to do. If we want more revenue in Washington, you got to grow the economy, and it is sinking fast, and I think it's headed the wrong direction.
Coming out of last Friday's meeting with the president and involving certain members of Congress from both the Democrats and Republicans, there was a little bit of an air of an optimism of some kind of compromise being worked out. The Dow Jones responded to that yesterday, up over 200 points. What kind of compromise could you live with?
I would support a compromise that actually creates jobs, and that's the problem here. Again, as I mentioned, the economy has slowed down. The economic experts, if you can call them that, really presume if we raise taxes, it's going to create another double-dip recession. And right now, that's where the divide is. But we got to find a way to grow the economy, and we do that by allowing small businesses to grow. And it's not a new concept. It's the way our economy has grown for decades. But when you have 47 million Americans on food stamps and record highs in terms of poverty, and everything is indicating, instead of talking about how much we can spend, we've got to look at balancing our budget. But beyond December 31st, we have another debt ceiling. Washington didn't cut any spending in the last 2 years, and we're about ready to head over a fiscal abyss that, whether it's tax increases or spending cuts, at the end of the day, we are running a massive debt because of too much spending.
Congressman Huelskamp, Brian Fisher here. A couple of questions that are different but sort of related.
Yes.
When it comes to this fiscal cliff, I think there are a lot of conservatives out in the heartland of America that would like to see the Republicans just say, no, we are not going to accept an increase on job creators. We're just not going to do it. Our economy needs to preserve those dollars, keep them in the economy where they can expand businesses, they can raise wages, they can create new jobs, and we're just not going to do it. I think they'd like to see that. And there's a lot of conservatives, I think, Congressman, who would like to see Republicans say, look, every appropriations bill has got to start in the House of Representatives. We are simply not going to agree to an increase in the debt ceiling. It's time, as the president has always said, we've got to live within our means. It's time to do it. We are just not going to raise the debt ceiling. We cannot keep kicking this can down the alley. The time to take sober responsibility is right now. Do you see either of those two scenarios having any likelihood of happening?
It will be tough. If you went out and talked to real Americans like you all and my constituents, they recognize the seriousness of the situation. They recognize that the problem in Washington is not that they haven't raised taxes enough. It's a spending problem. At the end of the day, you got to get the deficit and the debt under control, and that's a spending problem. Washington they're all talking about taxes. They're all talking about more revenue, both sides. But at the end of the day, when they want to raise the debt ceiling again and they haven't cut spending, we could have a debt auction where nobody comes up to buy our bonds. And they have added $5 trillion in debt in a little over 4 years, less than 4 years, and that is jeopardizing the future of America. So at the end of the day, the hands are tied in Washington. They might think they have a lot of room in a maneuver, but it is a spending problem, and they're going to have to face that problem sooner rather than later. I just hope we do it in a way that doesn't hurt the economy, but I have some fears that's where we might end up before the end of the year.
Now, clarification on just one question, Congressman, because I've talked to some of your colleagues who have said, look, we have to raise the debt ceiling because we can't allow the United States to go into sovereign default. Now, my understanding is you're not technically in default unless you are not satisfying your debt obligations. We have about $2.3 trillion in revenue coming into the federal government. It takes a little over $200 billion to service the debt, which is about 1/10 of what's coming in. So it seems to me we don't go into sovereign default unless we fail to service the debt, which we can do for about 10% of the revenues that are coming into the federal government. So it seems to me that that's a little bit of a veneer, sort of an excuse to raise the debt ceiling to talk about sovereign default when it would only take 10% of revenues to service the debt.
I think that is accurate. My office has been tracking the debt ceiling. Perhaps by the end of the year, or a little after, we'll reach the official breakthrough of that debt ceiling, but there are numerous cash management options for 2 or 3 months. But what we found out in August 2011 was the administration claimed that they were out of money, and that was not the case. But if you're going to raise the debt ceiling, you have to have a clear plan to actually cut spending. What happened in August 2011 was they raised the debt ceiling over $2 trillion and never cut any spending in those ensuing year and a half. And that is why the stock market's heading down. That is why folks are worried. That's why people around the world are saying, now, why should we buy more debt? And every day, Washington borrows another $3 to $4 billion every single day. It's out of control. And but much of Washington is still adrift, thinks it's holiday season, and not recognizing it's time to get our debt under control.
You're listening to Today's Issues with Fred Jackson and Brian Fisher, sitting in for Tim and Tony today, talking with Congressman Tim Huelskamp of Kansas. Just pivoting a little bit here, we understand in the wake of the election, there are at least some amongst Republicans who are kind of re-examining the soul of the party. Where do we go from here? I know one of the topics seems to be a compromise on the issue of immigration reform. Some conservatives also worried that perhaps the Republican Party is going to move away from its concerns with regards to abortion, with regards to upholding the sanctity of marriage, supporting biblical marriage. Do you hear these kinds of talks going on in the background? Does it concern you if they are going on?
They are not only in the background, they're in the forefront. There are many operatives in Washington, D.C., and that are suggesting that the Republican Party abandon our commitment to life and marriage and families, and if they want to do that, they will make absolutely certain they never win another national election. And but if you look back through the campaign, they didn't talk about social issues. The Romney-Ryan ticket, it was all economics. They forgot about the vision of future of stronger families and actually what it means for a job to the family and those kind of things. So I think we actually missed a grand opportunity to talk about the mandates of Obamacare. We had Catholics in particular have been identified and singled out and says, you will do this from the Obama administration, but most Republicans did not feel comfortable with talking about the real issue. And I think as a result, we did ourselves a disservice by ignoring those. And now you actually have folks that are trying to silence socially conservative voters and those of us that speak for them. But I think Republicans do a huge disservice to themselves and obviously the unborn. But, sometimes you have to stand for the right thing, even if you don't think it's going to win an election. And oftentimes Republicans, I think, have lost our way on fiscal and social issues by saying, hey, let's do something just because it sounds good now. And at the end of the day, we usually lose elections both ways.
Congressman Brian Fisher, one last question. Seems to me, from my vantage point, there's a stampede on the part of the Republican Party to move toward amnesty. They call it a path to citizenship, some kind of modified DREAM Act, all of which is one form of amnesty or another. And there just seems to be this rush to enact that kind of change, which is a departure from the rule of law and enforcement on immigration law. Where do you think that's going to wind up?
That's a very dangerous situation as well. I think there are a lot of folks in Washington who, some of whom were involved in spending $200 to $300 million, and they lost the election, and now they're looking for something to blame. But if the Republican Party abandons the idea of rule of law, abandons the idea of traditional values, again, we will be a minority party for a long time. But the issue of amnesty, there are folks in Washington who've, I think, wanted to do that for quite a while, and now they have an excuse to say, hey, that's going to get votes. But, the folks I talk to, minority groups, and numerous other folks that are average, ordinary Americans, whatever color, they don't believe in amnesty, but they do believe in a reasonable immigration system that's fixed. And but last time that Washington gave Americans the issue of amnesty, they said they'd secure the border, and they never did that. And it's a great time to have a discussion, but the idea that if we would pass a law giving amnesty and all of a sudden we'd start winning elections again, I mean, that's silly. That won't happen. That didn't happen in 1986. It didn't happen in 88. We didn't win because of that. We won because we talked about issues that matter to Americans. And that's what so many people on one side of Washington just don't get, because they don't get outside of Washington.
And I wonder, Congressman, I had 2 callers to my program, Hispanic callers, who voted Republican. I asked them why. And they said, we voted Republican because of values, because this is the party that stands for sanctity of life and marriage. I wonder, moving forward, if that may be one of the ways to make some inroads into the Hispanic community.
Well, I think definitely so. But you have to, I tell my colleagues, you just have to get off your you-know-whats and go out and talk to people. And they usually do not. And our message of opportunity is, I think that's the message that will get minorities of any group to say, hey, Republicans are the party of opportunity and freedom and life and family. And that's a strong positive agenda we haven't seen for many years.
Congressman, we have to run. Congressman Tim Huelskamp of Kansas, so good to have you with us again.
You've been listening to Today's Issues with Tim Wildman and Tony Perkins.